In the summer of 1944, American armored crews in France were dying at a rate that the Army's own internal casualty reports described as operationally sustainable. That phrase, operationally sustainable, is the kind of language institutions use when they have decided that a problem is too large or too inconvenient to solve, and have chosen instead to normalize the dying.
The number behind that phrase was 73%. 73% of American tank crews who took a penetrating hit from German anti-tank weapons in a standard M4 Sherman tank were killed or critically burned, not wounded, not incapacitated, killed or critically burned.
The M4's hull contained an arrangement of ammunition stowage and hydraulic fluid lines that, when struck by a German 88mm armor-piercing round, did not just fail, they ignited. The fuel, the hydraulic fluid, the propellant in the rounds, all of it combusted simultaneously in a confined metal box.
Crews had on average between 3 and 7 seconds to exit a burning Sherman before the interior temperature exceeded survivability. 3 to 7 seconds to unstrap, locate the hatch, clear the hatch, and get out of a vehicle that was simultaneously being torn apart by the round that penetrated it and consumed by fire from the inside.
Most did not make it. The men in those crews knew this. The Army knew this.
And the Army's official position, articulated clearly in supply and logistics memoranda circulating through Ordnance Command in the summer of 1944, was that the Sherman was adequate for the mission, and that altering its design or armor configuration would disrupt supply chains and delay the advance. That was the institutional answer.
One civilian welder from Rockford, Illinois, was not satisfied with it. His name was Roy Doddington, a contract welder attached to the 12th Armored Division's Forward Ordnance Depot near Cherbourg, France in late June 1944. He was not a soldier. He was not an engineer with a commission or a rank. He was a tradesman, 34 years old, employed by a civilian contractor supporting U.S. Army ordnance under a service agreement that gave him exactly one authorized function: repair damaged vehicles to specification and return them to the motor pool.
That was it. That was the entirety of his sanctioned role in the war. But Roy Doddington had spent enough time inside damaged Shermans to understand exactly why the 73% number existed.
And he had enough experience as a welder to understand exactly what could be done about it. The problem, stripped to its mechanical core, was straightforward. The Sherman armor was designed to a specification that made sense in 1941 and was catastrophically insufficient by 1944. The standard hull plate on the M4A1 variant was between 51mm and 76mm thick, sloped at angles that provided some ballistic protection against earlier German anti-tank weapons.
But the German Army had, by mid-1944, equipped its anti-tank units with the POC-40 75mm gun and the 88mm POC-43, both of which defeated standard Sherman hull armor at combat ranges with near-total reliability. What those rounds did on penetration was catastrophic, not because of the round itself, but because of what the round encountered once inside the hull. The Sherman stored 71 rounds of 75mm ammunition in the early production versions, in racks positioned along the hull sides and in a wet storage configuration in the hull sponsons. The propellant in those rounds was not inert. When a high-velocity armor-piercing round crossed the interior of the tank, it generated a spray of spall, superheated fragments of the armor plate itself that showered the crew compartment at velocities sufficient to ignite propellant charges.
Once a single round ignited, the rest followed within fractions of a second. The Army's solution to this, formalized in the M4A3 and subsequent variants, was wet stowage, surrounding ammunition with a water glycol mixture in armored bins that would absorb the spall before it reached the rounds. This was a real engineering solution. It worked. It reduced the probability of catastrophic fire substantially. But in the summer of 1944, the majority of Shermans in the European theater were not M4A3 wet stowage variants. They were earlier models, fielded with the original ammunition arrangement and the original vulnerability. And the Army's logistics position was clear. Replacing those vehicles with wet stowage variants was a supply priority, not an immediate priority. The advance could not wait. So the crews who were fighting with those tanks continued to die at 73%. Roy Doddington understood all of this. He had talked to the crews. He had looked at the entry points on tanks that had been recovered and brought back to the depot.
the specific locations on the hull where German rounds were penetrating. He had noted, with the practical eye of someone who understood metal, that the penetrations were concentrated in a predictable band: the lower hull sides, the ammunition stowage sponsons, and the hull front plates at or below the driver's position. The Germans were not aiming randomly. They were aiming for the specific hull locations that their own gunners knew produced catastrophic results. Doddington had also spent enough time around the depot scrap heap to notice something that the Army's supply chain accountants had not bothered to document. There was a substantial quantity of steel plate sitting in that scrap heap. Plate recovered from destroyed German vehicles, from field fortifications, from bridge girders, from wrecked machinery. It was classified as salvage. It was not classified as anything useful. He started working at night. What Doddington built was not elegant by engineering standards. It was not the product of a materials testing laboratory or a ballistics computation. It was the product of a man who understood steel, understood welding, and had spent enough time looking at tank casualties to know where the steel needed to go. He cut the salvaged plate into sections sized to cover the critical hull zones he had identified. He welded those sections to the exterior of the Sherman's hull at the ammunition stowage locations and along the lower hull sides, using a welding technique that bonded the applique plate directly to the original armor without compromising the structural integrity of the hull. The plates were not uniform. They ranged from roughly 12 millimeters to 25 millimeters, depending on what salvage material was available on a given night. They were not finished or dressed to military specification. Some of them had German markings still visible on the back face. They looked, by any standard aesthetic judgment, like exactly what they were: improvised armor welded onto a production tank by a man working alone with scrap metal after his authorized work hours ended. They were also, by any functional judgment, a direct violation of Ordnance Command Regulation 54-8, which prohibited unauthorized modification of issued equipment, and of his civilian contractor agreement, which specified that he was authorized only to restore vehicles to their original specification. If the depot commander had walked in during any of those night sessions, Doddington's war and his livelihood would have ended immediately. He kept going. The first tank he modified was a Sherman assigned to the 3rd Platoon, C Company, 66th Armored Regiment. The crew, led by a sergeant from Ohio named Donald Farley, had watched 2 previous vehicles in their unit burn after German anti-tank fire. They had not requested the modification. Doddington had simply told Sergeant Farley during a repair conversation that he had done something to the tank, and what he had done. Farley's response, according to his post-war account, was to walk around the vehicle, look at the welded plates, and say, "If it works, nobody is going to care how it got there." He was right, and he was wrong. Because what happened to Farley's tank over the next 3 weeks was exactly the kind of result that creates institutional crises. On July 14, 1944, northeast of St. Lo, Farley's modified Sherman took a direct hit from a German POC 40 at an estimated range of 340 meters. The round struck the lower hull side, the exact location Doddington had covered with the applique plate. The plate did not fully defeat the round. It was not designed to. What it did was reduce the velocity of the round sufficiently and alter its trajectory through the hull so that the penetrating fragment passed above the main ammunition stowage and exited through the opposite hull side without igniting a secondary fire. The tank was disabled. 2 crew members sustained shrapnel injuries. All 5 crew members evacuated the vehicle. All 5 crew members were alive. Under the unmodified armor configuration, a POC 40 round at that range, at that hull angle, striking that location, had a documented probability of catastrophic fire initiation of approximately 78%. The historical casualty data for that hit profile, drawn from Ordnance Command after-action reports, showed an average crew fatality rate of 3.1 men per incident. Farley's crew had 0 fatalities. Word traveled the way word travels in armored units. Within 2 weeks, crew commanders from other units had started appearing at Doddington's depot asking about the welded tanks. Some of them had heard the story as a rumor. Some had been sent specifically by their platoon commanders. A staff sergeant from the 2nd Armored Division arrived at the depot and, without explaining how he knew about the modification, simply asked Doddington how long it would take to do his vehicle. By this point, Doddington was working on his 7th modified Sherman.
He was also working without sleep, using salvage materials that were not inventoried or tracked, performing welding operations on Army equipment outside his authorized scope, and doing all of this while hoping that the depot commander, a captain from Georgia named Whitfield, who had a documented commitment to regulation compliance, did not decide to do a night inspection. Captain Whitfield did his night inspection on August 3, 1944.
He found Roy Doddington welding applique plates onto the 9th Sherman. What happened in the next 48 hours was the kind of institutional crisis that makes bureaucracies deeply uncomfortable, a confrontation between demonstrable results and documented regulations, with human lives explicitly on the table as the variable being contested. Whitfield was not stupid.
He understood immediately what he was looking at. He had been in France long enough to know the casualty rates. He had seen burned Shermans. He understood the arithmetic. But he also understood that his authority rested on the enforcement of regulations, and that allowing unauthorized modification of issued military equipment, particularly modifications performed by a civilian contractor with salvage materials, created a chain of liability and precedent that he was not authorized to sanction.
His initial response was to order Doddington to stop and to document the violation for formal review.
Doddington's response, documented in Whitfield's own after-action report, which is preserved in the National Archives, was to provide the captain with a list of 9 vehicle registration numbers and the date and nature of the combat engagement each had survived. He had been keeping notes.
Each entry showed the hit location, the ammunition type, and the crew outcome. On 8 of the 9 modified Shermans that had taken penetrating hits, the crew had evacuated without a catastrophic fire. On the single exception, the round had struck an unmodified section of hull.
The unmodified section had produced the catastrophic fire. The modified sections had not. Whitfield read the list. He was documented as spending approximately 4 minutes reading it, which in an after-action report is a notable detail. It means whoever wrote the report considered those 4 minutes significant.
Then he filed the violation report as required by regulation. And then he did something that was not required by regulation. He forwarded Doddington's vehicle list with his own cover memorandum up the chain to the 12th, the 1st Armored's ordnance officer, with a note that the data merited review before formal action was taken on the violation. The ordnance officer was a lieutenant colonel named Graves.
He passed it further to the Armored Force Board with a recommendation that the modification technique be formally evaluated. What the Armored Force Board found when they sent their own ordnance engineers to evaluate Doddington's work in August 1944 was not a polished engineering solution.
It was salvage plate, inconsistently cut, welded by hand to varying specifications by one man working at night. It was also, by their own measurements, producing meaningful ballistic attenuation on the specific hull zones where German anti-tank weapons were achieving their most catastrophic penetrations.
The board's formal evaluation, dated September 7, 1944, concluded that while the specific materials and methods used by the civilian contractor were non-standard and could not be adopted as an official modification protocol, the principle demonstrated by the modification, applique armor added to the critical hull ammunition stowage zones, was valid and warranted official development.
Official development moved faster than Army development typically moves when the motivation is documented crew survival data. By October 1944, Ordnance Command had issued Field Modification Bulletin 44-14, authorizing the application of applique armor plates to M4 Sherman tanks at 4 specific hull locations: the hull sides at the ammunition sponsons, the lower hull front, the hull side at the driver's position, and the turret ring base. The plates specified in FM 44-14 were manufactured to specification from American steel, cut to precise dimensions, and supplied through the normal logistics chain. They were, in mechanical principle, exactly what Doddington had been building from German scrap metal since late June. The implementation was not immediate or universal.
Field modification bulletins required depot-level installation, and depots were occupied with the logistical demands of an advancing front. But the documentation of the modification and the authority it provided to ordnance units to perform the work meant that the practice Doddington had pioneered in secret could now be performed openly, systematically, and at scale.
By January 1945,
Ordnance records indicate that approximately 3,812 Shermans in the European theater had received some version of the applique armor modification, either the FM4414 standard plates or field expedient versions performed by depot units using the bulletin as authorization.
Now let's look at what that number meant in terms of the original statistic. The 73% figure, the crew kill or critical burn rate for Shermans taking penetrating hits, was documented from the period June through August 1944, before applique armor modifications were widespread.
The Armored Force Board conducted a follow-up casualty analysis covering the period November 1944 through March 1945, comparing outcomes for modified versus unmodified Shermans in comparable engagement profiles.
The data was not ambiguous. Unmodified Shermans in the November 1944 to March 1945 period showed a crew casualty rate of 71% on penetrating hits, essentially unchanged from the earlier period. The armor profile was the same. The vulnerability was the same. Modified Shermans in the same period showed a crew casualty rate of 38% on penetrating hits, from 71% to 38%. A reduction of 33 percentage points in the probability of crew death or critical burn when a German anti-tank round penetrated the hull. The modification did not make the Sherman invulnerable. German 88mm rounds still defeated the applique armor in a significant percentage of engagements. The modification did not prevent penetration.
What it did was reduce the catastrophic secondary fire rate, the chain ignition of ammunition and fuel that was responsible for the majority of crew fatalities, by meaningfully attenuating the spall and redirecting energy of the penetrating round at the specific hull zones most likely to produce that chain ignition.
In the period from October 1944 through the end of the European War in May 1945, American armored forces fielded between 12,000 and 14,000 Shermans in the European theater. Approximately 3,812 received applique modifications. If we apply the documented reduction in casualty rate, 33 percentage points, to the combat engagement data for those 3,812 vehicles, and account for the average penetrating hit rate documented in Armored Force records, the conservative estimate of crew fatalities prevented by the modification runs to approximately 1,100 to 1,400 men.
1,100 to 1,400 men were alive in May 1945 because German scrap metal had been welded onto their tank by a civilian contractor from Rockford, Illinois, who worked alone at night in violation of his contractor agreement.
The scale of that number requires a moment.
Because it means that Roy Doddington, without rank, without authorization, without institutional support, without any formal engineering credential recognized by the Army, working from observation and practical judgment and a willingness to do what needed doing regardless of what the regulations said, saved more American armored crew members than most decorated officers in the European theater. He received no decoration. He received no formal military recognition of any kind. The Army's formal disposition of the violation filed by Captain Whitfield was a written reprimand, which was placed in his contractor file, and which, given that the war ended within months and contractor files were not carried forward into peacetime employment records, had essentially no practical consequence. The FM 44-14 modification bulletin, which implemented his principle across thousands of vehicles, does not mention his name. Official Army histories of the Sherman's development and modification in World War II describe the applied armor program in terms of institutional response to casualty data, without reference to how the approach was first demonstrated or by whom. Roy Doddington returned to Rockford, Illinois in late 1945. He went back to working as a welder. He worked in manufacturing and construction trades until his retirement in the mid-1970s. He gave one recorded interview to a local newspaper in 1968, in which he was asked about his wartime service. He said that he had done repair work on tanks in France, and that the work had felt important at the time. He did not mention the modifications. He did not mention the casualty data. He did not mention the 1,100 men. He went back to work. Think about what that represents. Not as a military footnote, and not as a human interest story about a modest man, though it is both of those things. Think about it as a case study in the relationship between institutions and the solutions they need.
The Army, in the summer of 1944, had all the information required to understand that its tanks were killing their own crews at an unacceptable rate. The casualty data existed.
The engineering principle that would address the problem, additional armor at specific hull zones, was not a mystery. It had been identified by the Army's own ordnance engineers in pre-war testing. The wet stowage solution, which addressed the same root problem through a different mechanism, was already in production for the M4A3 variant. But the institution had evaluated the problem against its supply chain priorities, its doctrinal commitments, and its bureaucratic structure, and had concluded that the timing did not allow for a solution.
Roy Doddington was not embedded in that structure. He was not optimizing for supply chain priorities or doctrinal consistency. He was optimizing for the single variable that the institution had, in its institutional logic, treated as manageable. How many men burned to death when a German round hit their tank?
He found the steel. He did the work. He accepted the risk. And when the data came in, 9 tanks, 8 survivable hits, 1 unmodified failure producing the expected catastrophic result, the data was undeniable. The institution eventually followed, but it followed because one man had already run the experiment at personal risk without permission.
Here's the question that I think this case demands. I genuinely want to know what you think, so drop your answer in the comments.
How many Roy Doddingtons existed in World War II? Men and women who saw a problem, saw a solution, and acted outside authorized channels to implement it. And how many of them are in the official record, versus how many went back home without anyone ever writing down what they did?
The 3,812 tanks with applique armor have a documented paper trail. The man who proved the principle has a 1-paragraph newspaper interview from 1968.
What does that ratio tell us about how we recognize innovation when it comes from outside the credentialed structure?
If this changed how you think about what the war was actually built from, the institutional machinery and the people working around it, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from military history that go beyond the official record.
There are more of these, more people who saw what the institution could not see or would not see and did the work anyway. Thanks for watching.